If you knew me then. Begin today with a reading a little bit longer than I typically use from the book of Acts, chapter 22, the New Testament. Then Paul continued, I was born and raised in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia and received my education from Gamaliel here in Jerusalem. My education was in the strict laws handed down by our ancestors. I was devoted to God as all of you are today. I persecuted people who followed the way of Christ. I tied up men and women and put them into prison until they were executed. I was going to Damascus to tie up believers and bring them back to Jerusalem to punish them. But as I was on my way and approaching the city of Damascus about noon, a bright light from heaven suddenly flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice asking me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I answered, Who are you, sir? The person told me, I'm Jesus from Nazareth, the one you're persecuting. Aside from Jesus, the Apostle Paul is by far the most prominent figure in the New Testament. Beginning with chapter 7, he becomes the main character of the book of Acts, the most influential apostle who helps propel Christianity from a fledgling movement to a growing and thriving world religion. The Apostle Paul is not only a dominant figure in the book of Acts, but the New Testament as a whole. Although authorship of the New Testament epistles is debatable, he is given credit for writing 14 of the 27 books that make up the New Testament canon. If you have not read the letters attributed to this apostle, should you ever decide to do so, you may find his books evoke a range of conflicting thoughts and feelings. The letters written by the Apostle Paul to the churches contain passages that are inspiring and uplifting. There are times his words are as poetic as they are prophetic. In his letter to the Corinthians, he beautifully expounds upon the power of love, writing, Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. In another passage, he writes words that I have gone to in some of my darkest hours for encouragement. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. But be careful as you find yourself lifted up and encouraged by the Apostle Paul's words. Because if you keep reading, you will also come across some teachings that will leave you not only troubled, but possibly enraged. For example, when he tells women to submit yourselves unto your husbands, and explains that the husband is the head of the wife. His misogyny continues as he exhorts women to not to teach nor to usurp authority over a man, but to learn in silence, going so far as to add, if a woman has a question during church, she should keep quiet and ask her husband at home. Possibly the most infuriating of the Apostle Paul's writings are his instructions that slaves should obey their masters, and his tacit endorsement of slavery, words that were used to justify the barbaric institution of chattel slavery until recent history. The Apostle Paul's words are indeed a mixed bag, encouraging at times, distressing at others. There are also times his words leave me perplexed. The passage I began by reading to you is one of those examples. It isn't that I don't understand what the Apostle Paul is saying as he describes his transformation from an anti-Christian zealot to a Christian zealot. What perplexes me is that he is choosing to bring it up at all. Why would he want his unconverted audience, and even more so, his fellow Christian converts and colleagues in the ministry, to know that he at one time was leading the persecution of Christians? Why would he intentionally remind the church that when Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was violently stoned to death, it was he who held the coats of the men that cast those stones? One would think that this would be a topic the Apostle Paul avoided, so I find it perplexing that he would choose to make it the topic of his sermon. People of my generation will often jokingly express that we are grateful that we were not born any later than we were, because we're the last generation who were able to make mistakes during our childhood that were not broadcasted permanently or preserved on social media. I am not only thankful that my childhood mistakes were not published on social media, but I'm even more grateful that I was not introduced to social media until my late 20s. Even with that being the case, I still sometimes remember that for the last few years of my career as an evangelical minister, I made CDs of the sermons I preached. And at times I worry that one of those sermons might find its way from a scratched 15-year-old CD to the internet. Silly as this seems, I actually worry sometimes that if this were to happen, you all and members of other congregations where I've preached and formed relationships will hear the words I used to preach. This concerns me because I am confident that if you had known me in 2002 rather than 2022, you would not have liked me very much. The guy in this picture, don't be deceived by his unreceded hairline and the confidence with which he wears a trench coat on what does not appear to be a very cold day. The guy in this picture is not a very likable fellow. He's not the kind of guy you would want to have a beer with. In fact, if you had suggested having a beer with him, he would have told you that drinking a beer is a sin, and anyone who partakes of it, even in moderation, is in danger of spending eternity in hell. As extreme as this sounds, it is not hyperbole. Yes, the person I was 20 years ago was harsh and judgmental. As I look back now, I realize that the two churches where I served as full-time senior pastor were located in high poverty neighborhoods. The 2022 Clint Tawes thinks of all the ways my church could have been of service to our neighbors. We could have promoted housing equality, provided relief for people who are food insecure. We could have spoken out about police brutality. I should have spoken up at a community clergy meeting where local ministers lobbied city council to enact a program that provided one-way bus tickets to homeless people to get them out of our city. But instead of preaching against inequality, I was preaching against women wearing makeup, jewelry, short skirts, or slacks. Instead of standing for justice, I was making sure the other ministers in my denomination knew where I stood on issues like going to movie theaters or divorce and remarriage. The unassuming young gentleman you see pictured here is a misogynist, but he doesn't know it. He thought he was somewhat progressive because he took an active stance in favor of allowing women to be ministers and worked in two churches under the leadership of women pastors. Nevertheless, his support for women in ecclesiastical leadership roles was conditioned on their strict adherence to puritanical standards of modest dress and, of course, dutiful submission to their husbands. And while he supported a woman's right to stand behind a pulpit, he very much thought he had the right to impose his religious views upon them and to take away their bodily autonomy. He was not just passively anti-choice, nor did he limit his anti-choice views to the pulpit. He served as president of a local anti-choice group, attended and organized protests, and lobbied lawmakers to impose his morality on the bodies of women. If you had met Clint Tawes in 2002 instead of 2022, you might have been standing on opposite sides of a protest. Quite possibly the worst thing about the guy in the picture here is that he was a hypocrite. He frequently lambasted the LGBTQ community from the pulpit, made snide comments whenever he saw LGBTQ people in public, all the while knowing that every homophobic word he spoke was said in an attempt to deny and mask who he was. If you had met me in 2002, you would not have liked me, and that's okay. I don't like the 2002 me either. I will say he does have one redeeming quality. Despite being a harsh, judgmental, misogynistic, homophobic, hypocritical closet case, there is one thing about this guy that I respect and that I will always admire. When he encountered people and experiences that forced him to question his belief, he was willing to confront his own cognitive dissonance, admit that he was wrong, and to change his views. That is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy to admit you're wrong, even about small things, But the young man you see in this picture eventually began to question and doubt what he had been taught, what he believed, and what he preached to others from the pulpit. As doubt turned to disbelief, he found the courage to admit he no longer saw the world in the same way, that he had been wrong in his theology, social views, and political beliefs. He admitted he was wrong, even though it meant losing his career, his family, and his friends. I still don't like to talk about this guy. Yet I've devoted a large portion of a sermon to doing just that. I do that not to tell you what a horrible person I used to be, but to talk about the beauty of change. I don't think the Apostle Paul especially liked remembering or talking about his past. The sermon he preached in the reading was not really about Saul of Tarsus, persecutor of Christians who wreaked havoc upon the early church. It was about the experience on the road to Damascus. The realization of his purpose, his life's direction was all wrong, and the ability to change. As I was preparing this sermon, I took some time to reflect in an attempt to pinpoint my Damascus Road experience. I immediately identified an experience as my Damascus Road experience. I mentioned to you all before in previous sermons, but if you happen to have missed it, during my final year as an evangelical minister, a teenager at my church came out to me, and then to his family, and then to the church, and everyone else in his life. He came out boldly and unapologetically, not seeking anyone's approval or permission to be himself. The courage I witnessed in this 16-year-old kid, without a doubt, played a role in my decision to come out the following year. As I continued to reflect, however, I began to think of other moments, other Damascus Road experiences. In 2005, I began taking classes at College of Charleston. Sitting in one of my elective classes, Jewish American Literature, we began to discuss a passage from a novel. I don't remember the title of the novel, but I recall that in the scene we were discussing, the main character quotes Isaiah chapter 6, where the prophet sees a vision of God's throne. The angels, using tongs, take a burning coal from the fire in heaven and bring it down to the prophet Isaiah, placing it upon his lips to symbolize his forgiveness and calling. I had read this scripture numerous times, but never in an academic setting. For a moment, I forgot that I was not allowed to question the Bible, and I asked myself a question. Why did the angels need tongs? Can a spiritual entity burn its hands? Did an angel find out the hard way during a previous prophet commissioning, prompting God to now require the use of tongues to transfer sacred fire from heaven to earth? As trivial as these questions were, this moment was not trivial. This was a Damascus Road moment for me, because once I allowed myself to question one thing, I began to question everything. Another Damascus Road moment was the 2006 State of the Union address that immediately after watching, I announced I was no longer a Republican. That was a big Damascus Road moment. As I reflected, I could go on and tell you so many more, so many times in which it prompted me to change my life. I came to the conclusion that there was no single Damascus Road experience for me, and I would venture to say that is probably the case for most people. Change is not the result of one life-altering experience, but our response to many people and experiences, some more memorable than others. We don't have a Damascus Road experience in our life, but rather life is a journey down Damascus Road, or at least it should be. Our lives should be a journey of countless encounters with new people, new experiences, new information that makes us question our values, our views, and our beliefs. I cannot imagine how sad my life would have been if I had not allowed myself to journey down my own Damascus Road, a road that represents awareness, growth, transformation, a lifelong pilgrimage toward self-actualization. A journey that many people deny themselves, believing the myth that consistency equals stability, and to be strong, one must remain static, unmovable in his or her convictions. We hear this sentiment in tribute speeches in which a person is praised for always staying the same, never changing with the times. During election season, a politician is accused of flip-flopping if what their position on an issue today doesn't align with the speech they gave in 1985. I'm not near as concerned about voting for someone whose view on an issue has changed as I would be voting for someone who since 1985 has not encountered one new piece of knowledge or a single life experience that would cause him to change their views. I don't want a leader whose views are swayed by public opinion at the expense of public good, nor should a leader's views ever change based on a lobbyist donation. But if what you know today tells you that you were wrong yesterday, there's nothing strong about being stubborn. It takes true courage to change. Emerson wrote, "The other terror that scares us from self-trust is our consistency, a reverence for our past act or word, because the eyes of others have no other data for computing our orbit than past acts, and we are loath to disappoint them. But why should you keep your head over your shoulder," he asked. "Why drag about this corpse of your memory, lest you contradict somewhat you have stated in this or that public place? A foolish consistency," he writes, "is the hobgoblin of little minds. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradicts everything you said today." When I was a student in Bible college, one of my favorite singers was Bishop Carlton Pearson. He produced several albums entitled Live at Azusa, featuring African-American spirituals and Black gospel music with an emphasis on the Pentecostal tradition. One of my favorite songs from his second album is the spiritual, "I Know I've Been Changed." And as spirituals often do, it repeats this line several times and ends with the line, "Because the angels in heaven done sign my name." Other than enjoying his music, though, I never thought much about Reverend Pearson. I knew from the albums he was a minister of the Church of God in Christ, a historically Black Pentecostal denomination and the largest Pentecostal denomination in the world. I assumed correctly that he was pastor of a megachurch somewhere. Years later, after I left the Pentecostal ministry and become a Unitarian Universalist, while working in my classroom one afternoon, I was feeling in the mood for some Pentecostal gospel music. So I began playing Live at Azusa album 2. As the song, "I Know I've Been Changed," began to play, a colleague popped her head into my door and asked if I was listening to Carlton Pearson. I knew she attended a Pentecostal church, so I wasn't surprised that she was familiar with him. As she left, she made a comment that puzzled me. She commented that she used to like his music. And she said snidely, "He sure has changed, but not in a good way." I immediately performed a Google search, and what I read fascinated me. Bishop Carlton Pearson, he was the senior pastor of a megachurch in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1994, he was especially moved and heartbroken by the atrocities that occurred during the Rwandan genocide. But even more devastating to Pearson than the loss of these innocent lives in Rwanda was what his church believed happened to them after their death. The idea that because they were not evangelical Christians, innocent victims of genocide would suffer for eternity in hell shook the core of Pearson's faith. Unable to reconcile what he had been taught and what he himself had taught about salvation, heaven, and hell with his understanding of the nature of God, Pearson began to preach a new message, that there was no hell and that salvation had already been bestowed upon every human being. This did not go over well with leaders of the evangelical and Pentecostal denominations. Pearson was denounced as a heretic and stripped of his credentials. His congregation dropped to half its number. Still, he continued preaching, receiving ordination from the United Church of Christ. But having lost much of his congregation, including wealthy members whose donations had sustained the church, he could not continue to keep the doors open. So he and the remainder of his congregation accepted an offer to have service at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Tulsa. After the 10 o'clock UU service, Bishop Pearson's congregation held service. But they found that the UU congregation preferred the more upbeat 11 o'clock service, and soon they were all worshiping together. Eventually, Bishop Pearson announced that he would no longer hold services, that All Souls UU Church would be his spiritual home, and he suggested to his now former congregation that they make it their church home also. They did, And today, All Souls UU Church in Tulsa is a unique Unitarian Universalist congregation with a very Pentecostal feel to its worship services. I so badly want to visit. Bishop Pearson's church, the All Saints UU congregation, and Bishop Pearson himself are all doing a tremendous work today because he was willing to say, I'm wrong, and allow himself to change. If you would ask the guy in the picture here where he would be on the first Sunday of September 2022, he would have answered in the pulpit of a Pentecostal church. And he would have gotten the pulpit part right. Who I was back then never anticipated becoming who I am today. The person I am today wonders who I might be in another 2 decades. I've marked my calendar for the first Sunday of September 2042. That falls on the 7th that year. I literally put it on my Google Calendar that, assuming I'm still on this side of the grave, to visit the UU Fellowship of Statesboro and to talk about how we've all changed. The person I was then, if you knew me then, I think you like me a lot better